فكلي واشربي وقري عينا فإما ترين من البشر أحدا فقولي إني نذرت للرحمن صوما.
Hey everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Islamic Maryam podcast. So for today, I want to move on to the second verse of Surat Maryam. Last time we talked about the opening verse and how this verse is distinct in the huruf al-muqatta, or the desperate letters. And today, let's move to the second verse, which talks about Zakariyya. So the second verse begins and says, "This is an account of your Lord's grace towards his servant Zakariyya, when he called to his Lord." So you see that the Arabic begins by says, "Dhikru rahmati rabbika abduhu Zakariyya." And we see that Surat Maryam, or the chapter Maryam, starts talking about Zakariyya. And this is important because we'll see that Zakariyya plays a role in the beginning of the chapter and is in many ways a foil or foreshadowing what is going to come. And what we see here in this particular verse is the idea of rahmah, or mercy. And this is the mercy of your Lord to his servant Zakariyya. And mercy is a dominant theme within the Qur'an. And many times when we look at Islam, especially here in the United States or in the West, we often see Islam as being harsh and stern and severe. In terms of Islamophobia, often we look at Islam as a violent religion, one against minorities or women. And there's this conception that the Qur'an in many ways are manifesting these themes, that God is harsh and stern and against the disbelievers. So in this particular chapter, we see the idea of rahmah, or mercy, that God is all merciful. And I believe this idea, this concept of God being all merciful, goes back to the Meccan era. So in the Meccan era, there was this conception of God, that he is transcendent, he is high, he is Qawil Aziz, he's powerful, he's almighty. But at the same time, people felt scared of this God, right? This is also in many ways the God of the Old Testament, or the Torah, that people are in awe of God. So to feel close to God, many of the Meccans imported and also created their own pagan culture, where they made idols and started to worship those idols because they saw God as being far away and not intimate and close. So Islam came with this idea, this conception, that God is actually close. فَإِنَّهُ قَرِيب, that he is actually close to someone and that he listens to the call and prayers of the servants. And this idea of God being close is also connected with the idea of God being merciful. And mercy, once again, is a major theme of the Qur'an. And mercy is a particular theme of this chapter, the chapter of Mary, or Surat Maryam. And mercy has this conception that God is strong, right? If someone is merciful, then they have power, then they have ability, but they choose to use that power in a graceful and beneficent way, that they're not trying to seek revenge, they are being compassionate, loving, and kind. And here, the surah, or the chapter, begins by mentioning the mercy of God on the servant of Zakariyya. And to emphasize this idea first of mercy within the Qur'an, you see that mercy describes all human relationships and relationships between humans and the divine. So, for instance, in one particular chapter, you see that the divine voice in the Quran says, كَتَبَ رَبَّكُمْ عَلَى نَفْسِهِ الرَّحْمَةِ. So, in this particular verse, it mentions that God has decreed, or your Lord has decreed on himself, mercy. So it is actually one of the characteristics of God that he's merciful, especially to the believers, that this is something that he has imposed upon himself, not just on humanity or on the prophets, but he has decreed that he will be merciful to those who are also kind and merciful. We also see that the Prophet Muhammad, he's seen as someone who is exhibiting mercy. وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. So in the chapter of the prophets, Muhammad is described as someone who is merciful, that we have not sent you except as a mercy to humanity, or all humankind. So we see this idea of mercy, that God is merciful, but we also see that the prophets, that the Prophet Muhammad and the prophets in general are supposed to exhibit this characteristic of mercy. Even if they have power, even if they are leaders and governors, then they're supposed to be kind and compassionate to those who follow them. We also see that God in particular is merciful to the believers. So there's this idea of repentance in Christianity and Judaism and many of the world religions. And we see that this idea of repentance and forgiveness is part of God's mercy. So in a famous verse, it says, قُلْ يَا عِبَادِيَ الَّذِي أَسْرَفُوا عَلَى أَنفُسِهِمْ لَا تَقْنَطُوا مِنْ رَحْمَةِ اللَّهِ. So it says, O Prophet, that God says, O my servants who have exceeded the limits, أَسْرَفُوا. They've gone into israf, that they have transgressed and they've committed sins. Do not lose hope in God's mercy, for God certainly forgives all sins. So there's this idea that someone should not despair in God. Humans should always go back to God for his grace and mercy because he's Ar-Rahman, he's the source of mercy, and that they should never totally despair in their plight or in their fate or their past wrongdoings, that there's always a sense of redemption. There's always this possibility that they can be redeemed. And this is not necessarily because of their own righteous deeds, but this is because of the mercy of God. And lastly, we see that the believers are told that they should be merciful amongst themselves. So we talked about God being merciful, that Muhammad, the prophets, are supposed to exhibit mercy. We see that God is merciful to the believers, but the believers are commanded and characterized as being merciful to each other. We see a verse that says, Muhammadur Rasulullah, that Muhammad is a messenger of Allah, of God. وَالَّذِينَ مَعَهُ أَشِدَّاءُ عَلَى الْكُفَّارِ رُحَمَاءُ بَيْنَهُم. So it says those people who are with him are stern against those who reject and fight against the community. رُحَمَاءُ بَيْنَهُم. And they're merciful towards one another. So the idea is that the believers themselves should exhibit mercy towards one another and shouldn't be exceedingly demanding or harsh. So we see that the idea of mercy goes throughout the Qur'an. It's one of the dominant names of God. Every chapter except one starts saying Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. And we see that this idea of mercy sometimes challenges stereotypes that we have of Muslims in Islam. Now, in this particular chapter, as we've discussed, is a chapter that comes from the late Meccan era. So this is not in the Medinan era where we have wars. This is not a chapter that talks about Islamic law, the Sharia, but it's a chapter that's talking when the Muslim community is weak and vulnerable. And we see that in this chapter, the word Ar-Rahman or Rahma is mentioned 16 times. So the chapter is roughly 100 verses. So almost a sixth of the verses have the word Rahma in it. So almost every 6 verses you have some mention of mercy, whether that's God being merciful or the prophets and believers being merciful among themselves. And we see that the word mercy is evident with Maryam. So when Maryam sees the messenger appear, she says, قَالَتْ إِنِّي أَعُوذُ بِالرَّحْمَنِ مِنْكَ إِن كُنْتَ تَقِيًّا. And here she sees the angel Gabriel in the form of a human being. And as we discussed, this may be similar to the Prophet Muhammad, who had a vision of Gabriel coming in the Mount Hira, in the mountain. And when he sees the angel in the form of a man and squeezing him, he becomes scared. And in a similar way, Maryam has this vision. She sees the angel Gabriel, and he comes to her, and she becomes afraid. And she says, I seek refuge with who? Bir-Rahman, the source of mercy. So the idea here is that this man is coming, and she doesn't know him. He's a stranger. He may have ill intentions, but she's asking refuge for the source of mercy, the one that has power, the God that is kind and compassionate, that even if you have power, then you act in a kind and just way. So she tells this person who she doesn't recognize, please be God-fearing, be conscious of God. God is powerful. God can punish, but he is merciful. So you should exhibit mercy as well. And we see that later, several verses later, that the angel Gabriel, Jibril, he responds. And when Maryam asks and says, how can it be that I have a child out of wedlock, the divine questioning, that we see that the angel says this is going to be the decree of your Lord. قَالَ كَذَلِكَ قَالَ رَبُّكِ هُوَ عَلَيَّ هَيٍّ. So the angel responds and says, so will it be. Your Lord says it will be easy for me. وَلِنَجْعَلَهُ آيَةً لِلنَّاسِ وَرَحْمَةً مِنَّا وَكَانَ أَمْرًا مَقْضِيًّا. And then he responds and says that Jesus, the child, will be an ayah, a sign to humanity. وَرَحْمَةً مِنَّا, and a mercy from us. So we see this, once again, this emphasis on mercy, that Maryam uses the word mercy. She says the God is all merciful, so please exhibit mercy in your actions. Then also Gabriel uses the word mercy and says that your child that is going to be born is going to be a sign to humanity and also a mercy from us. And this is something that's already decreed. And lastly, we'll see that this surah, or this chapter, is interconnected. So oftentimes there's a lot of emphasis on the verses on Maryam, which are fascinating and intriguing, but the verses of Zakariyya are important and set up the birth of Jesus. We also see that the later verses also exhibit themes that originate in the first half of the surah. So one of the concluding verses of this chapter says, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ سَيَجْعَلُ لَهُمُ الرَّحْمَنُ وُدًّا, and says, for those who believe and do good deeds, the most compassionate Ar-Rahman will certainly bless them with genuine love, wudda. And this is the only time in the Qur'an with this particular noun is used, the idea of wud, or wudda, the idea of intense love. So in this concluding verse and summarizing the chapter as a whole, it says that those who believe and do righteous deeds, then Ar-Rahman, the source of mercy, the merciful, will give the believers genuine love. And of course, there's different interpretations of this, whether that genuine love is paradise, whether that's genuine love in their life and in their relationships. But you see there's a connection between mercy and love, that the source of mercy, part of his mercy to humanity and humankind is love, and exhibiting love to all of creation. So to conclude, we see that this chapter is unique because it begins first with a desperate letters that are not found anytime in the Qur'an. After going through the huruf al-muqatta'a, we see that there's emphasis on mercy, that the chapter is going to tell us about a story that emphasizes the mercy of God. And what is this mercy of God going to be? It's going to be having a child. And this was interesting for me reading this chapter, because as a father myself, I never think of my children as a mercy, right? Sometimes you think of them as a burden, sometimes you think of them as a chore or a responsibility, but the idea that this is a mercy, that, as we'll see, Zakariyya doesn't have any children, and part of his call to God is to have children, even though that he's old and his wife is barren. The chapter begins discussing this idea and concept of mercy, and we'll see how this mercy develops and unfolds in Zakariyya's life, but also in the life of Maryam. That Maryam gives birth to Jesus, who is seen as a mercy to humanity and humankind. And we also see that when she is in need, when she is in a state of vulnerability, when she is alone and isolated, she will call upon God and the source of mercy, and God will respond and give her comfort and ease. Thanks once again for listening to the Islamic Mary podcast. I encourage you to subscribe and encourage your friends, students, and colleagues to listen to this podcast. We'll be going systematically through this chapter, and first talking about the story of Zakariyya, then speaking about Maryam, and then some of the other prophets. You are free to text me, email me, let me know if you have any thoughts, comments, ideas, suggestions for future episodes and seasons. You're welcome to review this podcast so other people may learn about it and find it, and Please visit my website to see my research, my articles and blogs, as well as join my newsletter, where I'll continuously update everyone on the forthcoming book on the Islamic Mary. Thanks once again, and take care.